everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Sabiha Rahman.
And I'm Walter Ruby.
I am an American Muslim.
And I'm an American Jew.
And we refuse to be enemies.
Absolutely do.
A happy new year to you all, but the outlook is bleak. The ceasefire in Gaza is now in its fourth month, and yet the sufferings of the Palestinians continue. More killings of Palestinians by Israelis, blockade of humanitarian assistance, escalation of settler violence in the West Bank, more settlements, more demolitions. And here at home, ICE arrests, deportations, DEI censorship, rise in white nationalism. The list goes on. Walter, is there any silver lining on the horizon?
Sabia, I'm happy to say that I see a silver lining. I see the emergence of a palpable silver lining that after 2 horrible years, starting on October 7th, 2023, during which our two communities fought against each other especially over the Israel-Gaza war, and allowed ourselves to be played against each other by the Trump administration to the detriment of both of our communities, a new and more hopeful paradigm has emerged, which may lead us to an early revival of the badly damaged Muslim-Jewish relationship. And I see 4 factors as contributing or being part of this new paradigm. And here I list them very quickly. 1 is the ceasefire in Gaza. Number 2, the election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York. 3, a shift in Congress from its unconditional support of Israel. And 4, a sharp rise in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and this time not only from the street or on social media, but also from the highest political echelons.
Well, let's talk about number 1, the ceasefire. How is that a factor?
Well, the signing of that ceasefire in early October, brokered by the Trump administration, which, while hardly ideal, and by that I mean it still allows Israel cover to carry out military attacks whenever it wants and continue to slow the delivery of food, medicine, and humanitarian aid. So despite all of that, it has greatly lowered the level of violence and killing. And it has offered vistas for a broader political settlement of Gaza. That is, of course, if the Trump administration shows a real willingness to pressure Israel, which unfortunately we haven't seen yet.
Walter, I have to disagree. I don't think the quote-unquote ceasefire revived Muslim-Jewish relations. As you have said, the killing continues, as does the withholding of humanitarian aid, and leading Jewish organizations, here I mean ADL and AIPAC, are silent. But go ahead. Let's talk about number 2, Mamdani's victory.
So the sensational, utterly unexpected victory of Zohran Mamdani, a Muslim American who has now taken office as New York City mayor, despite having an anti-Zionist history, on a platform of affordability, has transformed the American political landscape, and among those many factors is Muslim-Jewish relations. So while the organized Jewish community was very worried and upset and vocally angry about Mamdani's coming election, and then when he won, they initially greeted it with hostility, we have seen subsequently, since in the 2 months between the election and now, a kind of a mutual acceptance by Mamdani and the community to work together. And partly that was most dramatically manifested by the decision of Mamdani to keep New York City Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch, and for her to agree to stay on, even though she comes from a family with a long history of support for Zionism in New York City, leaders of the New York Jewish Federation over generations, her parents and grandparents. And then the other thing we saw in mid-December was a statement, the New York Board of Rabbis met with Zoran Mamdani, I think around mid-December, had a very positive meeting with the leaders of the rabbis of the board, saying they were, quote unquote, heartened by the mayor-elect's willingness to hear their concerns. So I would say we've come a long way since the election.
Okay, full disclosure. I live in New York City, and I was on the streets campaigning for Mamdani. What I witnessed during the campaign was the coming together of Muslims and Jews, at least in New York City. Not 100%, but to a sizable degree. What I found heartwarming about this election was experiencing firsthand the support of Jews, individuals and organizations. Young men wearing T-shirts saying Jews for Mamdani, organizations such as Jewish Voice for Peace, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, Bend the Arc, and a sizable electorate of Jews, 30%, voting for Zohran. Amongst the 104,000 volunteers knocking on doors and phone banking from across the nation were a significant number of young Jews. At his victory speech, among the massive crowd outside in the cold November night was a huge contingent of Jews.
Sabia, all of those are wonderful phenomena, and and all of them show that the two sides have ultimately agreed for now to focus, at least for now, and I hope going forward, but to focus primarily on New York City and not on the Middle East. And actually, this is very much along the lines of what the two of us have been saying on our podcasts and in our many interviews that we've done online and in person over the years. We've been saying for a long, long time that what our communities need to do, first and foremost, the Muslim and Jewish communities, is to agree to disagree respectfully on the Middle East, on Israel-Palestine, and when there's no alternative, but to work together for common interests here at home. And so that's what we've been recommending. That's what we're now starting to see. But it was certainly not the case in the 2 years plus since October 7th until now. So seeing movement in that direction, partly around Zoran's election, I think is a very positive development.
I second that. And here I must share a story. One of my Jewish friends, who is in her late 70s, is passionately pro-Israel. After October 7, she and I avoided meeting, afraid that the conversation would go south and we might lose our cherished friendship. And later, when we did meet, we avoided talking about the war. A few weeks before the mayoral election, she reached out to me and said, "Sabia, can I campaign with you for Mamdani?" I am embarrassed to say that I was taken by surprise. I told her that I was not doing door-to-door campaigning since it involves walk-ups, sometimes 6 flights, and instead was doing phone banking. She said, "I don't think I can do walk-ups either." Her mobility is limited and she walks with a cane. And she goes on to say, "But I was thinking that if we two could campaign together, that would be a message on its own." Although the sight of me struggling to get up the stairs with a cane just to convince someone to vote for Mamdani would be so powerful. So she decided to work on her skeptical Jewish friends on a one-on-one basis, calling each of them, and actually succeeded in converting quite a few. Now, why was she supporting Mamdani? Because of his platform, affordability. His position on Israel was not the driving force. The welfare of New Yorkers is what mattered. And that's just one episode of my staunch Israeli supporter friends campaigning for Mamdani. A friend of mine, Dr. Farouk Khan, penned in a guest essay in Newsday, and I quote, it evokes echoes of Andalusia at a time when Muslims, Jews, and Christians thrived together in southern Spain. This moment presents a historic opportunity to rekindle that spirit of covenant and cooperation, end quote. And then as Ruth Messenger, a Jewish politician, said, affordability has minimized identity politics.
Labia, all well and good. And again, kudos to you on your involvement in the campaign. Nevertheless, I would say that the evolving Mamdani Jewish rapprochement is still very much a work in progress. And let's not forget that while many progressive Jews voted for Mamdani and campaigned for Mamdani, including the friend you mentioned and others, in the end, he only received, as you said, about 30% of the Jewish vote, which honestly was very low, considering that he was the Democratic nominee, and Jews are one of the most loyal Democratic constituencies in New York and in nationally. So by comparison, last year, in the last presidential election in November of 24, Joe Biden received 65 to 70% of the national Jewish vote, which actually was a little lower than usual. So as you see that, compare that with 30% for Mamdani, and I think that puts it in proportion what happened, which was, I believe, that ultimately the large majority of New York City Jews decided that Mamdani was anti-Israel and therefore a danger to themselves.
Sorry to interrupt, Walter, but Jewish Democrats had two Democrats to choose from, Cuomo and Mamdani. In Biden's case, it was either a Democrat or a Republican. And many who voted for Cuomo for mayor, and that includes Muslims and voters across all faiths, were seeing their taxes go up under Mamdani. I live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and most of what I heard was high taxes.
So I think the question now, we can continue to debate this, but I think is to what extent the still extant split between Mamdani and the Jews, and by extension his strong support in the Muslim community, can that be overcome? Can that be turned around? The split that still exists. Actually, as I was indicating before, I am relatively optimistic that can take place, but it will take hard work and much willingness to compromise on both sides. Now, again, trying to put this all into context, historical context, part of the story is that Jews in New York City over many generations became accustomed. I mean, I would say 100 years really, have been accustomed to being at or near the center of political power in New York City. And over that period, all mayors, Jewish and non-Jewish, praised Israel lavishly and marched every spring in the Salute to Israel parade. When I remember when I was a kid, 50 or 70, let's say, when the 50s and 60s of the last century, New York City mayors and governors still counted the three I's as the heart of their coalitions, which was the three I's stood for Israel, Ireland, and Italy, which meant that Jews, Italian Americans, and Irish Americans were among the largest and most influential constituencies in New York City and voted overwhelmingly Democrat at the time. But now there are many other constituencies that are at least as large and influential. The Latino, many variations of Latino, African American, and African itself, which Mamdani, obviously family coming, although being Indian, kind of coming from Uganda, and then East Asian and South Asian, which would also include Mamdani. So there are many, many more coalitions. In fact, the one thing we learned was that right now, the Muslim community and the Jewish community in New York City are about the same size, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million. And so that's a big change from the days of the three I's. And now the Muslim community, of course, in the wake of this incredible victory, inspiring victory by Mamdani is fired up and strengthened, and I think that's ultimately a good thing. It strengthens the pro-democracy base, which has got to also ultimately include the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and others to fight for democracy in America. But right now, the whole situation still feels somewhat threatening to many Jews. Not all, as you said, but many, maybe the majority. And they can't kind of let go of the fact that New York City is about to have a mayor who will not say he supports Israel as a Jewish state, only as one that guarantees equality to all of its citizens, which of course it does not really do. And I think most of us realize that. Mamdani, and Mamdani, actually, one of the things he did during the campaign was a few times threatening to have Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu arrested as a war criminal if he dare comes here. So now Netanyahu is taking him up on that challenge. He's threatening to come, I think he said soon, to New York City, at the invitation of a city council member, a hardline Russian Jewish member named Inna Vernikov, who represents Brighton Beach and areas heavily settled by Russian Jews. She's a Republican, but she calls Mamdani a scam, and she's, very, very, so the very strong opposition to him. So anyway, so I would assume that the likelihood that he will come and that Mamdani will not try to follow through on his threat to arrest him, which would obviously be met by strong opposition from the Trump administration. And I tend to believe that Police Commissioner Tisch probably told the mayor-elect that she would not carry that out, although we don't have that on the record or officially. So his looming visit maybe in January will likely hearten the Jewish right that remains very strongly against Mamdani, at least for a few days. But the effect of all of this is a kind of form of psychic whiplash, I would call it, for Jews across the political spectrum, which again, one needs to remember is taking place in the context of increasing physical violence against Jews in the US and worldwide, especially last month's horrific attack on a Hanukkah celebration in Sydney, Australia. In that context of growing violence against Jews, and by the way, I should mention also that we saw a case of two Jews killed, actually who worked at the Israeli embassy in Washington, were killed at a Jewish center by someone supporting the Palestinian cause explicitly, and another group people Jews attacked in Boulder, Colorado. By a Muslim American, and so in that context, that's the Jews, like it or not, many are very, very fearful for their physical safety, and in that context, I think that Mamdani would do well to say even more clearly than he has so far that he disavows the slogan "globalize the Intifada." Because however one defines Intifada, and I understand the idea that Intifada is not necessarily a violent act, but still that phrase does feel to Jews like a physical threat.
Walter, in the case of Netanyahu, you know that not all Jews support his policies. So I wouldn't say that Mamdani's threat to arrest Netanyahu is a form of psychic whiplash for all Jews. The violence against Jews, yes, absolutely, which Mamdani condemned in no uncertain words. What I see is Mamdani reaching out to the Jewish leadership, rabbis in particular, making a concerted effort to assuage their fears and concerns. He was on Union Square to commemorate the October 7 memorial. He has been attending Hanukkah celebrations in private and public spaces and has appointed Jews to senior positions in his administration, as well as 6 rabbis to his transition teams. So as I see it, he is already positioning himself as mayor for all New Yorkers.
Okay, Sabia, it is true, as you say, that many or even most American Jews dislike Netanyahu and they abhor his, many of us abhor his pitiless destruction of Gaza, um, which many of us also feel is making life less safe for Jews in the diaspora, including New York, actually stimulating or strengthening anti-Semitism. So on the other hand, even for, but on the other hand, even for someone like myself, who believes Netanyahu is guilty of war crimes and ethnic cleansing in Gaza and on the West Bank as well, even for me, witnessing the Prime Minister of Israel being arrested by the mayor of New York would be psychic whiplash and a bridge too far. Another thing I would urge Mamdani to do would be to praise groups in Israel that are fighting for peace and justice for all the people who live there, both Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims and Christians, and to signal say something, recognize the work of groups like Standing Together, the Peace Now, the Parents Circle, projects, I should say NGOs like Project Rosanna, which I've been involved with, I'll mention a little later. All of these groups are involving both Israeli Jews and including Zionist Jews and Arabs and Palestinians coming out into the streets opposing the present Jewish supremacist government of Netanyahu and people even further to the right, and joining together to fight for a shared future of peace and reconciliation, justice and self-determination for Jews and Palestinians alike. Because why is this important? Because whatever the eventual dispensation, how things emerge there, the two peoples will be living together in perpetuity, and so in the same small land about the size of a little bit larger than New Jersey. So whether the dispensation turns out to be two states, one state, or a confederation, we will have to live together in that community between the river and the sea. And if Mamdani would make these kind of comments, I think it would show that he doesn't just blindly condemn Israel and Israelis as evil, which I do feel many people in the pro-Palestine communities, pro-Palestine movement, I should say, have been doing, and that is concerning. But that he's recognizing that he understands the beauty of the Israeli peace movement, and including Zionists who want Israel to survive as a Jewish state, but one that is genuinely offering equality to all of its citizens. A group that Mamdani has supported from the beginning, the BDS movement, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, does call for a boycott of Israeli universities and cultural institutions, which actually are independent of the Israeli government. And I know Mamdani has indicated he might be supportive of some of these things. I hope he would revisit his support for such measures as well.
So Mamdani has not condemned Israel or referred to Israelis as evil. He has condemned the Israeli government's policies of mass extermination of Palestinians. Walter, you and I have always maintained that criticism of Israeli government's policies is just that. It's not a criticism of Jews or anti-Semitism for that matter. Besides, he's a mayor of New York City, not Tel Aviv. That being said, I believe that Mamdani's win will jumpstart Muslim-Jewish relations if it hasn't already.
And I definitely agree with you on that, Sabia. But let's turn to the third positive development that I was mentioning earlier, which is a big shift in the U.S. Congress away from obedience to the dictates of AIPAC and unconditional support for Israel, no matter what it does, especially in the Democratic Party, but even among a smaller group of Republicans as well. And this new reality obviously came about over the last 2 years due to the widespread revulsion in American public opinion concerning Israel's military actions in Gaza, which killed more than 70,000 Palestinians, a huge number. and caused the destruction of 90% of the structures of Gaza. And so really just leaving this place that's destroyed, and what happens now. But in any case, that really deeply offended many Americans, and they were also very bothered by when some of certainly Netanyahu, but some of the Jewish community here would say, well, that if you're criticizing Israel, that proves you're an anti-Semite, which is not the case. If you're morally horrified by that, that doesn't make you an anti-Semite. And anyway, what my point is that we've seen a number of votes and a number of letters and statements in both the Congress, in the House, and then the Senate, showing that something approaching a majority, in some cases, sometimes an actual majority of the Democrats in those bodies are ready to support a denial of U.S. offensive weapons to Israel. And even a few Republicans, as I said, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who of course will be leaving within a few weeks, but have also spoken out forcefully. I mean, she herself blamed the Israeli government for genocide in Gaza, quote unquote, which has been a controversial thing, but has been almost entirely on the left. So those are some of the big changes in Congress.
I was actually surprised at these developments, but then I shouldn't be surprised. Definitely a positive shift in the paradigm.
And it's a really abrupt change too. It's not only a big change, but it's really an abrupt change. I mean, only last year in 2024, AIPAC successfully spent millions of dollars, and it knocked off several prominent members of the so-called Squad out of Congress, defeated them in Democratic primaries. Two of their, I guess, biggest targets, biggest scalps, if you will, were Cori Bush in Missouri and Jamal Bowman in New York City, or New York City and Westchester, were both knocked out. And now, but in really bald comparison, now a year later, Democrats who once counted AIPAC among their top donors have been refusing to take the group's donations. New York Times wrote a big piece about this in early October, and that AIPAC's annual trip to Israel, where they take all their Congress people to Israel, which was a formative experience for many lawmakers for decades, once would draw a majority of the first-term members, has seen a sharp drop-off in Democratic attendance in terms of people who actually make the trip. And as I say, a majority of Senate Democrats have voted for legislation in recent months, which didn't pass, but nevertheless called for the cutoff of offensive weapons sales to Israel.
That is a major shift.
And I've sort of seen this playing out in my own district in Maryland. I live in Western Maryland, the 6th district, and so I just wanted to share this anecdote because I've been involved in this. I've been working. I was kind of recruited by J Street, which is the liberal Jewish counterpart to AIPAC that works on the Hill, and they brought me on to try to work on our representative here in the 6th district, whose name is April McLean Delaney, and she was she's a freshman. And I heard, when at the start of the year, that she was going to be very tough, that she had a relationship with AIPAC that goes back. Well, her husband had been the representative here, I think, about a decade ago, and he was very much close to AIPAC, and so I started out writing letters to her and to her office and sharing J Street statements, and we actually had a meeting in early June with one of her legislative aides, the guy who was focusing on Middle East, and they were courteous, but then after that, it was kind of radio silence. I would send our material and sometimes not hear back at all. And so that was kind of the way it went. And so she seemed like she was about as solid an AIPAC vote as one would have expected, or one could imagine. And then suddenly, I would say in late October, her office called us and alerted us that she had voted for a couple of statements that had been, I think, wordsmithed by a J Street, really calling a couple. I think the two were to try to press the Congress should press the Trump administration to take the Gaza ceasefire and really make it work, go move on to the second stage, which would be a political stage, which would lead to some kind of Palestinian sovereignty or state eventually. So we urged her to do that. And then the other one was that there was this really egregious piece of legislation, which, or actually not legislation, but the administration had instituted a new policy in the State Department that they would not allow any holders of Palestinian passports to come to the U.S., including children who had been coming here to receive medical care. A few children. So she said that or her representative told me that McLean and Delaney now was supporting our position on those two votes, those two issues. I had a chance to speak to her briefly I guess early November. I went up to her and I thanked her very much for her change of position, and she was very, very sympathetic. But then she said that she actually had been influenced by another freshman rep whose name was Sarah Jacobs, who was a Jewish freshman Democrat from San Diego, California, and Sarah Jacobs basically said to April McLean Delaney, "Look, I'm Jewish, and I've switched away from a reflexive pro-Israel position. So, maybe you could do that too." Or I don't know the exact wording, but something to that extent. Or I just wanted to share that with you, and that had a big impact on April. So that was pretty good. And then we've seen that I've seen indications that some Jewish establishment organizations, which again had been very down the line in support of Israel's positions, including under Netanyahu, have begun to shift to more liberal positions. So one that I thought was a very significant what's the word, sign, is that the Greater Washington Jewish Federation is now awarded a very significant chunk of money to support the work of Project Rosanna in Gaza. The Project Rosanna, through our Palestine office in Ramallah in the West Bank, has managed to open several mobile clinics in Gaza, where we have actual Palestinian doctors and nurses treating Palestinian civilians. And it's almost unique at this point, because the Israeli government is still blocking aid coming in from the outside, including doctors, volunteer doctors from the West who would like to come. And so these clinics, as small as they are, but growing, represent something, make sure that Palestinians increasingly will be able to get medical care, because many of them have not even been treated by a doctor or nurse since the beginning of the war, since all the hospitals essentially were blown up. So the fact that the Greater Washington Jewish Federation is supporting these efforts, I think, is pretty significant.
Yeah. And I think, Walter, you mentioned that there was a fourth factor that had also caused a positive shift in the paradigm. Do you want to talk about that?
Right. So I would call this one a not so positive sign, but nevertheless, it's a transformative change. And that is, as I said, was the huge rise in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that we've seen, I would say, since the ceasefire. And I think it really threatens the viability of both of our communities. And I don't have to tell you, I mean, you'll talk about this a bit more, but Muslim Americans are deeply alarmed by the administration's increasing, zealotry against all immigration, including Muslim immigrants from Muslim countries who have almost basically been banned. As you know, Trump called the Somali community in Minnesota garbage, quote unquote. After the attack by one Afghan refugee, as horrible as it was, shooting two National Guards people in D.C., he just basically ended all support for Afghan immigration, including people who fought to protect American troops who were there, who served with the U.S. Army and expected that they would be granted refuge here if Afghanistan went back to the Taliban. That's happened, and now many of them or their relatives are cut off. So all of that feels very threatening to Muslims. And meanwhile, Jews across the political spectrum are shell-shocked by as I mentioned, the deadly attacks on the Jews in Washington and Boulder, by Palestinian advocates, and the sudden legitimizing of anti-Semitism and even neo-Nazism on the right, which as we know, that Tucker Carlson, probably the most influential commentator, if you will, on the right, podcaster with an audience of many millions, did a very sympathetic interview with an overt neo-Nazi named Nick Fuentes back in November, which really caused a sensation. And yet nobody, at least neither Trump or his heir apparent J.D. Vance, potential successor, I should say, have criticized Carlson for doing that. Trump said, well, he has the right to interview anyone he wants.
Yeah, this is disturbing and alarming, both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. When students at Brown University were shot and killed, the Islamophobes took to the airwaves and insisted that the murderer was a Muslim. A few went as far as falsely claiming that he shouted Allahu Akbar before shooting the victims. Laura Loomer commented on the shooter's style as evidence of his being Middle Eastern. Sean McGuire accused an innocent Palestinian student of being the shooter. At the Bondi Beach massacre in Australia, when Ahmed Al-Ahmed apprehended the killer, social media was flooded with vile comments insisting that the savior could not be a Muslim. All this starts at the top. Our president's statement regarding Somalis, the Afghan ban, revival and extension of Muslim travel ban, Governor DeSantis's unconstitutional executive order targeting CARE, Vicky Palladino, a Republican council member in New York City, Senator Tom Tuberville, and Congressman Randy Fine calling for mass expulsion of all Muslims from the US. Texas reviving the ban on Sharia law. And then there is doxing, expulsions, harassments, and assaults. I think how we respond to these incidents can either hurt our relationships or strengthen them. What do you think?
I completely agree. And I think in response to all of that and much more, is for both Muslims and Jews to put aside illusions that somehow they can, in some cases, work with this administration and realize that what is going on is increasingly an existential threat to the viability of both of our communities. We just can't go on anymore with business as usual, but we need to join together in addressing all of this. The concurrent threat that goes with all this increased Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, the concurrent threat to democracy, pluralism, and religious freedom, without which our communities really can't survive in a decent way in America. So I was very heartened to have the privilege to attend a meeting on Capitol Hill in mid-November that was co-sponsored by the Muslim Public Affairs Committee, MPAC, the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, which is called JCPA, and the Interfaith Alliance, a sign that a Muslim-Jewish engagement is coming out of the closet back into the spotlight just at the time we need it most.
Walter, I understand that you attended this meeting on Capitol Hill. Can you tell us about it? Like which of the elected officials were on the panel and who was the audience?
Okay, well, the moderator, first of all, was Maggie Siddiqui, a friend of mine and a senior advisor to the Interfaith Alliance and a non-resident fellow at MPAC, who's really been very involved in behind-the-scenes discussions, I would say, over the last year, and helping to move MPAC in a direction of really being behind supporting this whole effort to build a rapprochement. So she was as I said, the moderator. The principal speakers were Amy Spitalnik, who is the CEO of the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, and Salam Al-Mariyati, the president of MPAC. As you noted, the event was also addressed by a Muslim Congresswoman, Latifah Simon of California, and a Jewish Congressman, Jamie Raskin, Democrat Maryland, both of whom strongly endorsed strengthening the Muslim-Jewish relationship. And most of the attendees were staffers to various congresspeople, as well as longstanding Jewish and Muslim activists. And as I said, the event was a culmination of a long series of discussions, and I think which will now be extended further and move toward actual working together.
Let's put up some of these, some of the outcomes that came out of this. We reaffirm that neither our communities nor our democracy are safe when either community can be targeted.
We stand passionately for eradicating the very real problems of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia growing across the political spectrum, and believe we do that by coming together. We reject any attempt to divide us, such as the Trump administration's use of Islamophobic and other bigoted rhetoric, and the exploitation of legitimate fears of anti-Semitism in the service of an authoritarian policy agenda.
And the third joint statement reads, we aim to show that both our communities are safest when democratic norms and institutions are strongest, and we are weakest when our interests are pitted against each other.
You know, Sabia, if I didn't know better, I'd say JPA and JCPA and MPAC may have stolen some of these lines from one of our past presentations. Just kind of a joke. But in any case, we are obviously very, very happy to see influential folks in both communities getting behind this idea, these very important ideas. Certainly better late than never. And it's very, very important it's happening now. And I wanted to just, one last thing, I wanted to talk about a palpable change in perceptions about anti-Semitism on the Jewish right and left alike. And it's interesting because, you know, the Jewish right used to blame anti-Semitism on the political left, and they would justify cooperation with the Trump administration, you know, in using anti-Semitism as a cudgel against freedom of speech on campuses. That was kind of what the Jewish right was doing until now, and still to some extent is. And the Jewish left would blame everything on the political right. Now both sides are admitting anti-Semitism is a grave threat that supersedes both left and right labels. And it's been very interesting. I've been following a lot of podcasts of the whole story around, as I mentioned, Tucker Carlson and Fuentes, so I would say the Jewish and Zionist right are now admitting that these folks are blaming, you know, are overtly anti-Semites are coming from the right, and that they're blaming, including Tucker, I would say, blaming Jews for taking over the U.S. government, media, and the GOP. And in the case of another conspiracy theorist on the far right, Candace Owen, even saying that Israel killed Charlie Kirk. And as I said, but yet the MAGA establishment, including Trump, will not take Tucker on. So I think some Jews, such as Ben Shapiro, who just spoke at this big conference of the Turning Point USA, Mark Levin and others who have been very MAGA. They've been kind of, you might say, Jewish MAGA, or they are Jews. And Ben Shapiro, who really plays up his Jewishness, Ben Shapiro spoke out against all of this at the Turning Point conference. So they're clearly now denouncing right-wing anti-Semitism, including, and here's where it becomes really interesting, Trump's VP and likely heir apparent J.D. Vance, who has, you know, who spoke in his own speech at the Turning Point, was just very dismissive of the idea that he should criticize any conservative, including Tucker, or by extension, neo-Nazi Fuentes. Vance is also a couple of things that he goes further than some other MAGA people. He's a very strong advocate of the concept of heritage Americans, which means basically descendants of white, English, and Scottish, Irish Americans of the 18th and early 19th century, and somehow claiming that because they've been here for all that time, that somehow they're more authentically American than all of us. That would include Jews and Muslims, who the vast majority of our ancestors came after 1850, which sounds like a long time ago, or 1880, and yet for them that's not good enough. And not to mention that he said that Vance said forcefully in the same speech that, quote, America is a Christian nation. And so this white Christian nationalist formulation that he's now tapping into very aggressively devalues the present day Muslim and Jewish communities. And I saw that, and this was an interesting straw in the wind, that even Morton Klein, who I've covered for decades when I was a Jewish journalist, a right-wing, a very hardline right-wing president of the Zionist Organizations of America, is now supporting Ted Cruz to run for president in 2028 against Vance, because Cruz has spoken out against what he sees as rising anti-Semitism in the conservative movement. And then just to come back quickly to the Jewish left, I think there's more of a willingness now on the Jewish left to admit that the killings, for example, at the Jewish centers in DC, the attack in Boulder, and of course what happened in Sydney, is this is anti-Semitism and a threat to the physical safety of all Jews, regardless of left or right. And that's why I said there's a lot of concern about the slogan, globalize the Intifada. Again, whether it's accurate that most users of that slogan actually endorse violence against Jews, I think that's doubtful. I don't believe they do. But at this point, Jews of all political stripes, really feel vulnerable, personally vulnerable to violence.
To that, I would say that we need to stand up for each other when the other is attacked unjustly. I'm grateful to many social justice and advocacy groups that have taken a stand against Islamophobia, like NAACP, ACLU, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Florida Council of Churches, the League of Women Voters of Florida, Southern Poverty Law Center, and many major local civil rights, advocacy, and faith-based organizations. And as you said, we must work together. I am a member of the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, an organization of Jewish and Muslim women committed to fighting bigotry and hatred. I am a co-leader of the New York City Action and Advocacy Group of the Sisterhood, and our mission is to work together for peace and justice in New York, North America, and Israel-Palestine through activism and advocacy. We participated in a silent march organized by Jewish elders calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. We were in Union Square at the October 7 Memorial. We are seeking a meeting with Mayor Mamdani to identify areas of collaboration, all with the idea and intent of unifying Muslims and Jews here in New York City. And we too are holding an all-day series of meetings on Capitol Hill in April.
Sabia, that's wonderful. I'm just curious if you feel at this point that the Jewish and Muslim members of the sisterhood are on the same page on this whole issue of anti-Semitism.
Some of my Jewish sisters in New York have told me how much they fear for their safety with Mamdani at the helm. On this issue, the Muslim leadership can play a role in alleviating their fear. I would like to see Muslim leaders help their followers understand Jewish existential fear and urge them to extend a hand and reassure their Jewish brethren. Tell them that they are there for them and will stand up for them if under attack, and invoke episodes when Jews stood by Muslims during the travel ban. Tell them that Muslims too feel fear with the Islamophobic invective directed against them. I purchased a kafaya, and for a long time it was my cover photo on Facebook to express my solidarity with the suffering of the Palestinians. But I was afraid to wear it on the streets of New York City. While campaigning for Mamdani, I was heckled and harassed, and a female friend of mine was assaulted. All this on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. But I have to say that what gives me hope on the issue of safety is Mamdani's announcement to retain Jessica Tisch as commissioner of the New York Police Department, and Tisch accepting the offer. Jessica Tisch is Jewish, a strong supporter of Israel, and deeply committed to fighting anti-Semitism. That says a lot about Mamdani. His transition committees include 6 rabbis, and Ruth Messenger, a heavyweight in her own right. So let's emphasize the positive and assuage the fears of our Jewish brothers and sisters. And while we are dispelling misconceptions, we must also understand each other's perspectives. Understand how much the plight of Palestinians and justice for them means to Muslim Americans. How much it hurts us to see settler violence in the West Bank, the starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, and how much it means to have a mayor speak to that sentiment. Our Jewish brethren need to understand that Islamophobia has been allowed as acceptable discourse in the US at least since 9/11.
Yeah, that's true. And in truth, yeah, we still have a long way to go. I noted that at the event on Capitol Hill, MPAC's president Salam al-Mariyati made clear that he does not yet see the Jewish community, the overall Jewish community, taking Islamophobia as seriously as it takes anti-Semitism. And that, as you said, that mainstream Jewish groups like the ADL and the American Jewish Committee are still cooperating with the Trump administration in its efforts, supercharging anti-Semitism, weaponizing anti-Semitism to lead to a crackdown on free expression, freedom of speech on campuses across America, with various forms of repression against pro-Palestinian expression. Which is hitting a lot of Muslim students, some here on green cards, and some are American citizens. So Salam, seemed to be saying that he would like to see groups, liberal groups in the Jewish community like JCPA, to be even more forceful than they have been so far in demanding that the Jewish community stop cooperating in the administration's weaponization of anti-Semitism and other things, the expansion of the travel ban to include holders of passports from the Palestinian Authority. As we know, the liberal Jewish organizations still largely opposed the use of the term genocide to describe Israel's actions in Gaza, which El Mariati and other MPAC leaders have used, although not at the event on Capitol Hill. But similarly, many Jewish leaders are really grateful for MPAC's strong denunciation of the DC and Boulder attacks as overtly anti-Semitic, without tying them necessarily to attacks on Israeli "quote unquote" genocide, as other important Muslim organizations have done. So, for example, CARE denounced the Boulder attack as "quote a heinous and unacceptable crime that does not represent the countless Americans of diverse background working to end support for the genocide in Gaza," which seemed to many Jews to really be tin ear, or not addressing our own fears violence, which of course came up after those attacks. And I do think, by the way, I wanted to make one other point, which was that as regards someone like Randy Fine, who was called for expulsion of Muslims from the United States, that there should be a resolution in Congress and with Jews getting behind it, Jewish members to denounce that as absolutely un-American, absolutely unacceptable. In the same way that there was a resolution that went after Ilhan Omar for, I think, much less justification than that would have been. So that was something that I would certainly like to see. So anyway, to sum up from my perspective, our communities obviously still have a long way to go, but I do think that the trend lines now are in the right direction. So many Muslims and Jews with um, who have enhanced Jewish communication and cooperation uh, in the 2000s and 2010s, and culminating with Jews standing with their Muslim brothers and sisters against the first Trump travel ban in 2017, and then later a year later, Muslims supporting Jews after the horrific Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh in 2018, including the two of us. We know that a revival of that alliance by the two largest and most influential religious minority communities in America is possible, and in fact, it's desperately needed to make effective an interfaith coalition standing up for democracy, pluralism, and religious freedom for all faiths in America. And in general, standing against in opposition to the even more overt efforts by this second and much more dangerous Trump administration and MAGA movement to create an America based in white Christian nationalism. So finally, after 2 years, I would say almost complete futility, we are again back on the right track. But let's keep our foot on the gas and keep really working on this issue and bringing our communities together, because the time really is truly short to save America, both that both of our communities love and thrive upon, to save that America, that golden city on a hill which is open to people of all faiths, colors, and creeds and national origins who believe in those ideals.
So on that positive note, let me close by saying that at the mayoral inauguration, when I watched people of all faiths, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, celebrate and welcome Mayor Mamdani, I knew in my guts and in my heart that the familial bond of Muslims and Jews is intact. We may stray apart for a while, but we always come back. We are, after all, cousins in faith. Thank you all for listening. Be safe, be well, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to all.